Good afternoon. Okay, maybe my mic is not on, but I said good afternoon. Listen, hello, goodbye, good afternoon, good morning are all call and response. And so, and I'm going to say from a serious standpoint, it can make or break the day of a person in a community. So when you can make the day of a person and just say hello. I'm Fred Riley. I'm the executive director of Weave, the Social Fabric Project, and I have the pleasure of introducing David Brooks today, who is a dear friend, a visionary, and one of the most humble people that I've ever met. I could talk about the New York Times or the Atlantic or the books he's written, but I like to talk about him as a person just for a little bit. I often get asked this question by people who say, what is it like working with David Brooks? And they go, oh my God, he's such a celebrity. And I go, he doesn't know he's David Brooks. I'm very serious. He is just a normal guy who's super smart and who gets all these things that he writes to help change our country. He founded Weave while traveling around the country, hearing about or writing about polarization, but he'd go to town after town and hear the stories of people who are showing up for one another, who are knitting our country back together. And so he's here today to talk about how we can heal our country. I believe it's through Weave, but it's probably through the workings of David Brooks that he's going to write about in the New York Times. So without further ado, Mr. David Brooks.
Thank you, man. Thank you, Fred. So I founded Weave in, I think, 2018. And for the first couple of years, I was the executive director. And I have never run anything. I've worked at the New York Times for 23 years. I've never been to a meeting. And suddenly there were budgets and like planning, strategic plans. And so I had the one brilliant decision to hire Fred. And I remember the first meeting, he was like, giving this team clear instructions, offering positive feedback. I was like, oh, this is how you do that. Like, so it's a great pleasure to be with Fred. And it's a pleasure to be in my 20th annual talk at the Ideas Festival. This one will be less funny except for when we get to questions. So Charles de Gaulle wrote a book, a war memoir. And the first sentence was, all my life I've had a certain idea about France. Well, all my life I've had a certain idea about America. And that idea is that America is about human dignity. That it's all men are created equal, endowed by their Creator with inalienable rights. That's about human dignity. And the second idea about America, it's about mobility. We have energy, we move. We move physically, we try to move up economically, and we try to move spiritually to get to a better place, to improve. I was talking to some kids today and this week, and for some reason 3 times the Hamilton the musical came up. And some of you may know a little about Alexander Hamilton. He was a Puerto Rican hip-hop star from the northern. But you listen to the lyrics of that musical, coming up from the bottom, just you wait, want to be in the room where it happens, not throwing away my shot, and my favorite, I'm like my country, young, scrappy, and hungry. And that's, to me, what America is. Lincoln, when he was a poor boy, had a rowboat, and 2 guys needed to cross a river, and he rowed them across. And they threw a silver dollar into the boat to pay him. And he said later, decades later, you may think it was a very little thing, but it was the most important incident of my life. I could scarcely credit that I, a poor boy, had earned $1 in less than a day. The world seemed wider and fairer before me. Opened up opportunities, opened up his vision, his possibility for his life. And so we tell these stories of exodus, of movement. MLK talked more about exodus in the New Testament. FDR told a version, JFK told a version, Reagan told a version, Obama told a version. Movement and mobility. I hope I don't embarrass my dear friends Stuart and Linda Resnick. If you walk around Aspen or anywhere you see, you know the generosity they've produced. But they didn't start out with the means they have today. They built great companies, and now they've created communities in the Central Valley, and they've created a museum here, and all sorts of stuff. That's America. But there's been a different story of America which has prevailed more recently, and which Donald Trump tells. It's not about mobility. It's about protection and security. We live in a dangerous world full of threats. We live in a world of American carnage. America we know is being taken from us. We need to build walls. We need to erect tariffs. And if there's a consistent strategy, it's not about mobility and risk. It's about power. It's about amassing power. And if there's a constant strategy, it is to create a world where power is uninhibited and where ruthless people can thrive. And one of the ideas that were behind Hamilton and FDR and Reagan was that America is an idea as well as a homeland. But one of the things J.D. Vance emphasizes is that America is not an idea. It's a homeland, which is traditionally how other countries have seen themselves. But we've always seen ourselves as an idea. And there's a reason they have to deny the idea that America is an idea. If America is an idea, then we have a moral responsibility to try to reduce poverty around the world and enhance human dignity. You can't go around cutting PEPFAR. You can't go around cutting malarial research. There's a guy at Boston University, a mathematician, who's counted up the costs already of Trump's decision to gut USAID. It's already, we're 5 months in, 400,000 dead. Tens of thousands of dead children. And that one decision fills me with a kind of rage that I don't usually experience. If America's an idea, we have a responsibility to try to spread democracy where we can. You don't support Vladimir Putin against Zelensky. But if America's not an idea, then we can do that. If America is an idea, then anybody from around the world can come here and become American citizens and celebrate that. They don't have to be white. They don't have to have been here for 7 generations. But if America's not an idea, it's a homeland, then we can just be like ourselves. And so, until January 20th, 24, and even in Trump's first term, I didn't realize how much of my identity was based on this conception of America. How much of my daily life and the way I think about my life and all the lives I see around me was based on this idea. And in the past 4 or 5 months, I've experienced it as a moral injury, as sometimes a sense of shame that I've never felt before about the country, sometimes a sense that we're on the wrong side. So how did we get here? I'd like to talk about how we get here and then how we recover. Well, there have been very few historical shifts in the last 150 years, movements that shifted history and shift the whole climate of opinion. The first one was the totalitarian movement in 1917 that produced the Russian Revolution and authoritarianism and totalitarianism, both of fascist kind in Nazi Germany and the communist kind in Russia and China. That was a movement. Then there was the welfare state movement that produced welfare states in Europe and in our country, the New Deal with Franklin Roosevelt. Then in the 60s, there was a liberation movement about helping people who are marginalized realize their rights. And that was anti-colonialism around the world, but in this country it was the civil rights movement, it was the feminist movement, and eventually the LGBTQ movement. Then there was the market liberalism movement of the 1980s, which gave us Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan and Deng Xiaoping. And recently we've lived in a new historical era, since I think about 2013, which is the global populist movement. If you look at the climate of opinion, not just in America, but all around the world, people are disgusted with established power. Ipsos Research did a poll, and America fits right in with the world. Our opinions are average for the world. 59% of Americans say they believe their country has declined. The global average is 58. 61% of Americans say the system is broken. Global average is 60. Our hostility to elites is average. 69% of Americans agree the political and economic elite don't care about working class people. That's average. 67% say experts in this country don't understand the lives of people like me. Average. Our authoritarian tendencies are average. 66% of Americans say the country needs a strong leader to take it back from the powerful. 45% of Americans say we need a leader who's willing to break rules. And so that's populism. Where did populism come from? Well, there's some obvious explanations. It's a reaction against public policy events. Financial crisis, Afghanistan, Iraq, inequality. And of course, on a superficial level, that's true. But there's also deeper more psychological and social reasons. We've just gotten a lot sadder as a society, and this has been an obsession of mine for the past decade. Mental health problems are rising. Suicide rates are up by 30%, 60% for teenagers. The number of Americans who say they have no close friends has risen by fourfold since 2000. The number of Americans not in a romantic relationship is up by a third since 2000. The number of Americans who rate themselves in the lowest happiness category is up by 50% since 2000. We've just become sadder. And when you become sadder, you become meaner. Because you feel isolated, you feel under threat, and you lash out. My sister-in-law is a nurse in New Jersey, and she says her biggest problem is keeping staff because the patients have become so abusive. The nurses burn out. I can give you all sorts of stats on meanness. The one that bugs me is that a generation ago, 3/4 of Americans gave to charity every year. And now fewer than 50% of Americans give to charity. Just pulling in. And so what creates this spiritual crises? And I go back to psychology. There was an attachment theorist who was writing about 70 or 80 years ago named John Bowlby. And one of the things I've learned from him is that all of life is a series of daring explorations from a secure base. All of life is a series of daring explorations from a secure base. And what is that secure base? Well, for most of us, it's family. It's loyalty to a sacred place, our home. It's loyalty to a country. And it's also a secure base, a moral base, that we live in a moral order, that we're held together in a community by a shared set of values. There's a historian named George Marsden who wrote of Martin Luther King, what gave such widely compelling force to King's leadership and oratory was his bedrock conviction that the moral law was built into the universe. That segregation is not just wrong in some times and some places. Slavery is not just wrong in some times and some places. It's always wrong. There is a moral order. It's wrong. It reduces the dignity of a human being. And in my view, over the last 60 or 70 years, we've become a much more individualistic country, which in some ways has been wonderful to us, unleashed all sorts of wonderful energies. But we've torn away some of those covenantal secure bases. Families are weaker. Communities are weaker. And the moral order has been frayed. This was seen all the way back in 1955 by a great columnist named Walter Lippmann. He wrote, if what is good, what is right, what is true is only what the individual chooses to invent based on his feelings, we have left the grounds of civilization. And you can't have trust unless you have a moral order. Trust is the faith that you will do what you ought to do. And for us to trust each other, we have to have a shared sense of what you ought to do. We have to have shared norms. Like if two lanes are merging in the highway, then the right lane goes and the left lane goes. And if you butt in line, I'm going to honk because I want to enforce the norms. But when you take away that shared order, trust dissolves. A generation ago, 60% of Americans say people around me are trustworthy. Now it's down to about 30%. And 19% of millennials and Gen Z. If you ask Gen Z, do you agree with the following statement? Most people are selfish and out to get you. 72% say yes. And so that's just psychological hard. Imagine living that way. And so to me, that's the anxiety. And existential anxiety always leads to fanaticism. We've taken away the secure base. I'm going to read this passage about that. All fixed, fast, frozen relations with their train of ancient and venerable prejudices and opinions are swept away. All that is solid melts into air. All that is holy is profaned. All that is solid melts into air. All that is holy is profaned. I've just quoted from the Communist Manifesto by Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, which I don't usually quote from. But I think they're right. And so, and this anxiety is not equally distributed in society. It overlaps with the crucial divide in our society, which is not really income, it's education. People with high school degrees die 15 years sooner than people with college degrees. People with high school degrees are 5 times more likely to die of opiate addiction. People with high school degrees are vastly less likely to marry and much more likely to divorce. people with high school degrees are 2.4 times more likely to say they have no friends. And so we've created this caste structure in society, and the pain is felt up and down society, but particularly in those among less educated who don't have the opportunities and security that some of us have. And so what can we do about it? Well, how do countries come back from this? It's not just a policy problem, it's a spiritual and psychological and emotional and social problem. Well, in my view, we already are. Think about times in your own life when you've gone through hardship. When I ask people what made them who they are, nobody ever says, I had this fantastic vacation in Hawaii. That really made me the person I am. Like, nobody ever says that. People talk about some challenging time they got through with others. And I went through a hard time in 2013. My kids were leaving to go to college. My marriage fell apart. I was living alone in a crappy little apartment. And I was doing what any middle-aged male idiot would do in response to an emotional crisis, which I became a workaholic. I tried to work my way through it. And if you'd gone to my little apartment, I wasn't having anybody over. And if you pulled out one of the drawers where there should have been silverware, there were Post-it notes. And where there should have been plates, there were stationery. I was just working all the time to cover over an emotional crisis. And Paul Tillich, a 1950s theologian, said that moments of suffering interrupt your life and remind you you're not the person you thought you were. He wrote, they carve into the floor of the basement of your soul and reveal a cavity below, and they carve into the next layer and reveal a cavity below. In these painful moments, you see deeper into yourself than in normal times. I listened to a lot of Sinead O'Connor, a lot of sad Irish music. And then Henry Nouwen's a Catholic theologian, and I remember in 2013 I read him, and he said, you have to stay in the pain to see what it has to teach you. And I was like, screw that, I want to get out of the pain. But he's not wrong. And then finally I read a novelist, Frederick Buechner, said that when you're in your moments of suffering, you can either be broken or broken open. And people who are broken make themselves invulnerable. They cover themselves over with a callous, thick armor. But people who are broken open make themselves, even in the pain, more vulnerable. And that's the only way change can happen. And so I've just described personal process. And the process, personally, is rupture and repair. You go through a hard time, you learn more about yourself, you change. And I think radically changed. I'm going to drop a name. I was interviewed by Oprah. I've been lucky enough to be interviewed by her twice in my life. Once before 2013 and once in 2019. And after the second interview, she pulled me aside and said, David, I've not seen someone change so much in middle age. You were so blocked before. And then a couple of years after that, I was in Nantucket. And I was at a conference just like this, and there was about this number of people in the room, and the speaker gave us all pieces of paper, and on the pieces of paper was lyrics to a love song. And he said, okay, I want you all to find somebody you don't know, gaze into their eyes, and sing the love song to them. And if you had asked old me to do that, I would have spontaneously combusted. But I found some old guy, I gazed into his eyes, and I sang the love song. And there were no sparks, unfortunately, no chemistry, but I'm different. And I'm blissfully, happily married. My wife's working in the hotel room. And she takes a look at videos of me from 2000, and she always has the reaction, well, I wouldn't have married that guy. And so you can change. And if it's true of a person, it's true of nation. Jared Diamond wrote a book called Upheaval, where he talked about all the nations that went through this process of rupture and repair. And they're not unusual. Britain in the 1820s and 1830s, Britain again in the 1980s, Australia in the 1970s, Germany and Japan after World War II, South Korea in the 1980s, Rwanda after 1994, Chile in the 1990s. And this country, too, has been through its periods of rupture and repair. In 2000, I read a book called The Promise of Disharmony. Taking a look at the clock. Good. By a great political scientist named Samuel Huntington. And he writes in that book that I've noticed this weird pattern in American history About 60 years or so, every 60 years or so, we go through what he calls a moral convulsion. People get disgusted with established power. They want to tear everything down. Marginalized groups demand inclusion. A passionate young generation comes on the scene. There's a new form of communications technology. He said this happened in the 1770s with the Revolutionary period. It happened in the 1890s when we really struggled to create a society around an industrial economy. Massive corruption, massive inequality. It happened in the 1960s. People forget how brutal the 1960s were. Riots, assassinations. In 1969 alone, there were 4,000 bombings on college campuses. We forget how ruthless that period seemed. And then he said, I don't know if I believe in 60-year cycles, but if the pattern holds, sometimes around 2020, America will go through another moral convulsion. So I'm reading this in 2020, I'm like, well done, Professor Huntington. And the good news is we come out of them. We come out different, rupture and repair. And so how does the process happen? Well, let's take two examples. I mentioned Britain in the 1820s. In Britain in the 18 teens, it was a brutal economy. The first wave of industrialization wiped out all sorts of jobs. The work in the factories and the coal mines was brutal. And morality was, it was totally acceptable to get drunk at work and go home and beat your wife. That was a norm. And so it happened in three phases. First, there was a religious revival, sort of something called the Clapham sect, which not only was about God, but it was the beginnings of Victorian morality. The beginnings of, like, don't get drunk and beat your wife. And also abolitionism. Second, there was a civic revival. Civic organizations burst into life. A guy named William Wilberforce led the abolitionist movement. And third, there were a group called the Chartists, who were like an early union. And then third, there was a political movement, which led in the 1840s to the Reform Acts, which broadened the franchise. More people could vote. America in the 1890s. First, there was a spiritual shift, a cultural shift. Social Darwinism, which was popular in the 1870s, was the belief that survival of the fittest, that poor people are poor because they're lazy. That was replaced by something called the social gospel movement, which was about community. Poor people are poor because of systemic injustice. So that was the cultural shift. Then there was a civic renaissance. So within the 1890s, within just a few years, you had the creation of the Boys and Girls Clubs, the NAACP, the environmental movement like the Sierra Club was founded then, the settlement house movement, which was Jane Addams in Chicago and other places to help immigrants. And so you had this whole growth of civic life. And then, third, you had political reform, the progressive movement, that created the Food and Drug Administration, eventually the Federal Reserve System, the Civil Service Act to clean up government. And so in both the cases I've described, it went cultural, people shift in values, civic, and then political. And so I think that's a reasonable formula to look at our current moment. Well, where are we today? We're certainly in the middle of a moral convulsion. It's on the right, it's frankly also on the left. This guy Mamdani, who just won the mayoral primary in New York, what's he all about? The establishment is letting you down. He's a Democrat who's figured out how to marshal this populist moment. I don't particularly like his politics. I'm not a socialist, though I do quote Karl Marx. And so we're in this convulsion, but one of the things that happens in the convulsion is that people try radical change like Donald Trump offers. And one of the problems with populists is they don't respect institutions. They're not really good at running things. They're good at destroying, but not great at running things. Andrew Jackson